Hello, everyone. We're going to get started. My name is Harmony. My ancestral name is Sitlakis, and I'm from Tla'amin Nation in British Columbia. So I'm joining from the West Coast today on Tsleil-Waututh territory. Can we jump right into the next slide, please? So just an overview of what we're all doing here today. So this is webinar 3 in a series organized by self-governing Indigenous governments to provide some hands-on practical knowledge in data for Indigenous governments. So as noted, today's session 3. Today we're going to unpack a bit terms and concepts, the data context amongst the IGs, and then we've got 2 kind of primary modules. One is about how do Indigenous governments go about navigating and accessing data held externally to these governments. And then we're going to talk about how to establish structures within Indigenous governments for the management or the governance of data. Can you let me know in the chat for folks that are on, is this your first webinar? Were you on the previous ones? It'll just give me a sense of whether we've got a bit of a cohort developing here and how much background to give as I go throughout the deck today. So today, I'm delivering a lot of the content as well as my colleague Laurel that I'll introduce shortly. So we're going to walk you through kind of a big chunk of information on data governance. This builds on what we talked about in previous webinars. So we talked in the past about the session 1 kind of took us through a set of core concepts, and we had Gwen Phillips from Toolkit Nation come and share their experience working with data. And then session 2, we talked about incorporating data into Indigenous government. So we walked through an assessment tool, and we talked about change management and how to bring people along with the change. Today, in data governance, we're going to be talking through that, but we're also going to be setting up the next webinar. So you see there's been a little bit of shuffling. There's some strike throughs on the slide you can see. So the next session that we have will be on indicators. Then we'll have a session on collecting and analyzing data, and then we'll wrap up with data management and information management. A reminder to those, it looks like in the chat, we've got a lot of folks that have been on previous and some new. For those that have received a survey from the last session, just a friendly reminder to fill that out if you get a chance. You know, we're really interested in evolving this set of webinars and the toolkit to make sure that it really is tailored to your needs and that we're delivering content that's actually helpful for you. So the other thing that I just wanted to flag briefly before we jump in is, again, you have advisors available to you to support your work at a local level. Like here, we're giving big picture content, and we recognize there could be a big gap between kind of what I'm saying and your reality every day. And so the advisors that are available to you should help you kind of bridge that gap and hopefully make the content we're delivering here actually able to be picked up and applied. Next slide. So we've adjusted some of the housekeeping a little bit. So as with previous, the webinar will be recorded and posted, but you will not be recorded. So if you turn your video on, you won't be recorded. It's actually helpful for me if people turn their videos on, because otherwise I'm talking to myself and it's a very strange experience. So I invite you to, if you're comfortable, turn your video on. What you can do is go into the top right-hand corner of your Zoom screen. If you click on view, you should be able to select side-by-side gallery, and that will allow you to see everybody else on this webinar as well. And it does create just a bit more of a friendly environment, I think. We're going to pause a couple of times and try to get some discussion going today. Feel free to throw questions into the chat, and we have folks that are supporting this, helping me pull any questions that are provided through that mechanism, or you can also put up the hand up function, and I'll stop at a certain point and invite that. I also just wanted to note that as I did in previous webinars, just where I'm learning and just some things you to know as I'm trying to navigate this. One is, again, I'm really trying to train myself in my work with you all to use the term government. I'm coming from BC and I tend to use nation a lot. So again, I'm trying, and if I make that mistake, please just recognize it's unintentional. I sometimes will be looking over here at my second monitor or looking down at my notes. I'm already talking too fast, I'm sure. I get kind of excited. I'll try to keep a measured pace, and I'm sure we're all still figuring out the technology. So I hope I've shut off all the dinging that was going on in the first two webinars, but I guess we'll find out. Next, please. I think we pretty much know this by now, but in terms of Zoom, mute, unmute, start, stop video, bottom left. Again, you can turn on your video, you won't be recorded. Chat, people seem to know how to use that. There's active stuff happening there. And if you'd like to raise your hand, bottom right-hand corner. And as I said, in the top right-hand corner is where you can change your view of what you're looking at. Okay, I think we're through all the housekeeping. Can you flip through one more slide? So what I just wanted to briefly do, I'm not going to belabor this too much, but I just want to take a few minutes to reground ourselves in some of the language we've been using. So I've been trying to start each webinar with a set of key terms that we'll be using throughout that particular webinar. The toolkit includes quite an extensive glossary of terms, which is very helpful. Not all of those terms are used every single webinar, so I'm just trying to pull the most relevant. And some of these we did talk about, particularly in webinar 1, so I'm resurfacing some of those same terms today. So obviously we're all here to talk about data. So data is information. That information can be stories, it can be facts, it can be numbers, they can just be observations we make. All of that is helpful for us in making decisions, referring to that when we make decisions. And doing so is a basic activity of government. Why? Because it helps us make better decisions. It informs policy, it informs our plans. As a result, it improves the quality of what we're delivering, improves the outcomes for our citizens, enables us to uphold our accountabilities, whether that's reporting to citizens, fulfilling reporting requirements of different funding agreements, celebrating success along the way, and ultimately creating new knowledge and understandings that, again, is part of a continuous improvement cycle that governments are responsible for delivering. A database is taking all of that kind of collection of data in some sort of system where it can be accessed and managed. Next slide. So in the self-governing Indigenous government context, we talk a lot about data sovereignty, which is the ability of your government to access, collect, control, utilize data about people and planet. This is tied to obviously the kind of government's rights. What we have on the slide there is OCAP. OCAP was developed in a very specific context, but as it applies to Indigenous governments, it just recognizes the sovereignty or the rights of the government to own the information as a collective, to make decisions about how it's used, to access it wherever it resides, as well as control who else can access it, and wherever possible to possess it. And increasingly, this is virtual possession, as so much of our data is stored not in physical records. Next slide, please. So today we're going to dig into data governance specifically. So what we're referring to there is the authority of a government to make decisions about data. And really what we're talking today about is a lot of the more practical, tangible processes. So in webinar 1, Gwen Phillips talked to us a lot about kind of big picture vision and view. Today, we're going to talk about, okay, how do we apply that in both external and internal environments? It really is the governance process that makes sure that data is appropriately managed. And then data management are all of the processes for doing so. So how do we generate, collect, store, and particularly protect and ensure that data is secure? Next slide. So we're going to talk a little bit about outcomes and indicators today, but really this is to set up the next webinar in which we'll dive into this a lot more deeply. But like an outcome is the statement that lets us know when we've achieved what we want to achieve. And then the indicator is a piece of data that tells us how we're doing in reaching that outcome. So you see Indigenous teachers teaching in Indigenous schools. That's an outcome that the government wants. Then we might track the number of Indigenous teachers teaching in Indigenous schools. We would track the number of Indigenous schools that are teaching in traditional languages. And then on socioeconomic gaps, like those are examples of outcomes that are aspirational outcomes driven by the government. We are also tracking things like disparities between the citizens of our governments and other Canadians. And so that's often framed in the context of a socioeconomic gap. So if we think about things like in BC, we know that life expectancy for First Nations is 9 years less than other British Columbians. So that's an example of a socioeconomic gap that we want to use to advocate for greater investment and work to close. Next slide. I know this is like a lot of words. This is the last slide on key terms. So these terms kind of relate to some of the data governance processes we're going to speak through today. So data steward, we're going to talk about what does a data governance structure look like within an Indigenous government context. So a data steward is a specific part of that process. It's an individual or department within your government that would be responsible for data within their section. Custodian would be responsible for the technical aspects of it, largely, typically kind of IT people. We're going to talk about personal information and anonymized or de-identified information. So personal information is identifiable information about an individual and is subject to significant protections and laws. De-identified data is where that personal information is removed. And then disaggregated data, we'll talk a bit more about, we're going to talk about the movement within Canada to greater disaggregation of data, which is where we take kind of big data and we make our people kind of visible within that in different ways. So whether we can take a big data set and we can say this is Indigenous people within this data set, or these are the women in this data set. Okay, so those are all the words. I know that's a lot. And I just want to take a couple seconds to talk about the self-assessment tool. So Adam Perry walked us through that last time. If you can go to the next slide. I just want to make the connection between the tool and some of the stuff we're going to talk about today. Like it's not kind of one-to-one, but again, like we're trying to design the webinars and the content we're delivering here in a way that helps you use some of the aspects of the toolkit. So there's a whole section in the self-assessment about data governance that asks questions about whether you have a structure in place within your government. We're going to talk through today some of the key considerations and options for doing so. We're going to talk about law and policy with data governance today. Next slide. And then there's also the final, I think it's the last section of the self-assessment tool, talks about the available data that your government would have to work with. So Laurel and I will be talking a bit today about like sourcing data from other organizations, as well as managing and governing data within your government context. The webinar 5, I think, talks about collecting data. So we're just going to set that up today. We're not digging into that between Laurel and I today. Okay, so maybe I'll just pause there for just kind of a couple minutes and see. I know that was a lot of content, but it's all intended to just be framing housekeeping stuff before we start to dig in a little bit more. So are there any kind of top of mind questions about any of those key terms or what we're going to talk about today? Can we go to the next slide? Feel free to throw any questions in the chat. So what we're going to do is there's kind of like 3 little modules we're going to walk through. This first one is kind of a bit more setup, history, kind of connecting it to your context. Then we're going to go into sourcing external data. Then we're going to go into data governance structures internally. So again, I'm kind of delivering a lot of content today, along with my friend Laurel, who's hopefully you can see spotlit on your screen as well. Laurel and I do a lot of work together, and Laurel's done a lot of work with Indigenous communities and organizations across the country on data. So if we can go to the next slide, I'm going to kick it off. So I talked very briefly in the first webinar about data and Indigenous peoples. I didn't go into it in depth. And again, today is, I'm not delivering a class on that, so I'm going to keep it fairly brief, but it is really important context for us to understand why data sovereignty is so critical to us, not just as governments and carrying out the function of governments, but to us as people, given our unique history. So, our cultures come from primarily an oral tradition. And the process of colonialism introduced this written tradition and framed that as being superior to oral histories. Like, we're kind of coming from this very different paradigm and way of thinking about what data is and how do you pass on data and how do you transmit data. And that kind of difference and the positioning of Western knowledge and written knowledge as superior to our practices and our teachings has been a matter of continuing evolution and debate and fighting in the courts, quite frankly. So it really is only in fairly recent times that our traditions of oral histories and oral transmission of data and knowledge has been acknowledged. Additionally, data has been used against Indigenous peoples in a lot of ways. So not only are we coming to this with kind of our way of being framed as inferior, but also then that data or the counting of Indigenous peoples has been used against us, right? So a lot of people were moved on to, say, reserves, counted, forced to, kind of being provided a status number, having that track them everywhere, getting permission to leave the reserve and come back. So those are all things in which, it's not really been beneficial to us necessarily to be counted. Within, and all of that is not just at an individual personal level, but kind of broader as well, right? Governments have determined what matters and they collect data that matters to them. And that's not necessarily what matters to Indigenous people or Indigenous governments. So they decide what matters, they decide how to collect data about it, and then decide how to report on it. And often this has not benefited Indigenous peoples at all. Indigenous peoples have been portrayed in reports as being, genetically inferior, inherently sick, dying off, vulnerable. Like, those are all stories that have been told about us through data through time. And that's not beneficial to us. And often our data is taken from our communities and used for someone else's benefit. So there's a long history here. And again, I don't want to trigger people. I don't want to kind of get into some long diatribe about it, but it's just a very important context because it explains a couple of things. One, it explains why it's the work that you've all done to negotiate your agreements is so critically important, and why many other Indigenous peoples are pushing for OCAP, pushing for data sovereignty, because we want to control the narrative of our own citizens. It also explains why many of our people might hesitate about governments holding data about them. So I think like that often even in my own nation, right? I was having a conversation with Laurel yesterday in preparation for today, being like, how much data am I comfortable with my government holding about me? And that's not necessarily specific to my own government, but it is related to this hesitation I have personally about kind of being counted. And I assume that those are issues that all of your governments will also be grappling with within your own citizenry. And it's part of why talking about the power of data and the benefit of data to them as citizens and to the governments collectively is important. I would also just kind of in conclusion on this slide offer that if that kind of thing is helpful, like having a bit of a tool to explain how did we get here and the power of data, certainly that's like a type of tool we could build out in the toolkit, and then you could take a PowerPoint or some sort of document and tailor that to your setting in order to generate greater understanding, awareness, and support for greater data governance in your own context. So that's my little history recap, and I'm going to turn it over to Laurel to talk a bit about the current state of data and other governments.
Thank you so much, Harmony. And I'm really pleased to be here today and contributing to this webinar. Could you change the slide, please? Thank you. So a little bit about external governments. There's tons of data out there. Governments love to, I'm talking about external governments, they love to collect data and they love to store it and they love to make it as inaccessible as possible. That's just the nature of government, I guess. But certainly there are multiple government sources for data that might be of interest to Indigenous governments. I've only put up 3. I mean, we've done some work here within the IG group on looking at health and education databases. There's also social, many other. But suffice to say that you know, there is all this data out there. It's a bit of a black box. I don't want to use the word confusing because it's more that it's just not visible. And often that the different databases, they don't really talk to each other. They're fractured. So, for example, if you wanted to look at chronic disease and maybe have an association between that and education outcomes, well, you know, unless you went to the regional health survey and were part of the RHS, and there is a question on, you know, self-evaluation of chronic disease, and you can, but that's one thing. But if you want to get that from external governments who have these massive databases that cover the whole population, it's very difficult to make those types of associations. So you're basically looking either within health or within social or within education, for example. Only high-level analysis are available, and by that we mean, again, government doesn't really like to share the information that much, so they're going to make it as big chunks as they can and have data governance protocols. They'll have cell size restrictions I'll talk to in a minute that mean that perhaps you can't get the data on your own Indigenous government. You might have, maybe you're restricted by the geographic boundaries of the health system, that sort of thing. Certainly, I mean, First Nations surveys, Inuit surveys are great from the perspective of being strength-based indicators, you know, the First Nations driven or Inuit driven. And I recognize that there's going to be an Inuit health survey coming out in 2021, which is just wonderful news. But they do vary in coverage. Not all Indigenous governments or nations otherwise participate in these. And even within that, even if a government participates, it is a sampling. It's not your entire population that is being surveyed in your in the regional health survey. So, and it relies on it being a random coverage that people were randomly assigned, that there was no bias in who decided that they would be part of the RHS and who didn't. But also the RHS is only held every 5 years. These other surveys that have come up from the FNIGC, First Nations Information Governance Center, they too are, they're new and they probably will be very intermittent, which makes it difficult to have timely data, and it doesn't allow you to trend from one time period to another very well to check for improvements in your population or changes. And as wonderful as the First Nations and Inuit surveys are, one of the, maybe it's a good limitation, I don't know, but the general population often doesn't have comparator indicators because they don't look at from a strength-based perspective, they're more deficits-based. So you may not be able to, if you want to use some of the data that you generate yourself, or perhaps from a First Nations or an Inuit survey, you may not be able to do a direct comparison against the general population. So going back to external governments again, I can kind of diverge there for a little bit to other external sources of information. And of course, the RHS may be external to you if you didn't participate in it. But going back to external governments, data collection has never really been aligned with Indigenous needs, realities, or priorities. I've already made the example that geographic boundaries may not align with nation boundaries, for example. There's different patterns of aging. So, the age groups that might be possible, thanks. The age groups that are possible may not necessarily align with the age groups of interest for your population. And there is no positive obligation to collect data that matters to Indigenous people, for sure. And of course, as Harmony's eloquently highlighted, the data is from a deficit-based perspective. When it comes to, okay, so we've come through all these barriers, but government says, yes, there's Indigenous data there, and then we have a process, you can access it. Now it comes to, what are they actually collecting? So is it, have they collected through self-identification, meaning if a person comes up to a point of service, for example, the hospital, and they can self-identify as being Indigenous, they may not want to, right? There may be safety issues. So that introduces a bias in the reporting and a bias in the data. In other instances, it may be that the government is using the Insured Services Plan. Here in BC, it's MSP, but it has different names, OHIP or whatever, where there's a mechanism of knowing all the people who are First Nations or Inuit in that particular database. So you have to kind of navigate through that as well to make sure you understand what is the Indigenous population that's being identified. Cell size issues, and this is huge for Indigenous governments. And this all comes down to privacy and privacy legislative barriers or requirements. Maybe barriers isn't the right word. There's a positive onus on all governments, yourself and others, to protect the privacy of individuals, certain circumstances. And so what governments do in terms of databases, they're saying, well, we're not going to let you have any data that represents people that are less than 5 in a group or less than 10 of a group. It really depends on the jurisdiction. And that's just so that you can't identify a person in that particular data set. Where that really, you come up against a bit of a hard wall there, because with small populations, comparatively small populations, if you want to, I call it slicing and dicing. If you want to look at age, and you want to maybe look at the gender of the person and the age of the person and maybe some other variables, all of a sudden your number of people get smaller and smaller and run up against the cell size issue. And the last one is about timeliness. I did allude to that when it comes to survey data, but also when you're requesting data from government. I haven't talked at all about data linkages, but that is one process where you can take a database that has Indigenous demographic information in it, First Nations or Inuit, and then match it up against the government database and pull out all the Indigenous information from that. It's wonderful. It takes time. Governments don't put a lot of resources towards it. There's a big queue. It can seriously take a year or two if you're going down a route of doing a new data linkage to pull information out. Okay, so that's that slide. If you can go to the next one, thanks. And Harmony alluded to disaggregated data before, and I think it's this particular report came out in BC. And you may recall that Gwen Phillips talked, I wasn't part of the webinar, but Harmony did mention to me that, the grandmother perspective is not a big brother perspective, which is like just capture information and control everybody. It's really the grandmother perspective is we want to know because we care. And so, which is a lovely frame for this report that looked at all aspects of disaggregated data, which is really using data to show different populations and where they fit in the larger fabric of data, of society, of change, whatever. And it is a strong tool. This disaggregation, it's worth the effort that it takes to go to government to demand for disaggregated data, because it will allow systemic change to occur by, it's the old deficit paradigm, by highlighting inequities with the dominant population and using that as a catalyst for policy and program change. So yes, governments in some provinces are talking more about disaggregation of data, and I believe in the last federal, was it speech from the throne? Yeah, I think that's what it was. The government of Canada committed to more disaggregation of data. Thank you. So, and the next one is off to Harmony. Thank you.
So all of this is not to kind of demoralize you. Like, it's just important to understand the context and to kind of have a healthy dose of reality that things are still very fractured in the data environment, but things are trending towards the better in terms of a greater focus on disaggregated data. It's still something Laurel and I strongly believe in, that Indigenous people should be pursuing their data wherever it's housed. It's just that once you kind of get it, then there's going to be work to do to work with it, recognizing its inherent limitations, and still use that to inform your decision making. But ultimately, like, what do the IGs need? So I'm going to talk about that and talk a little bit about what that would look like kind of from a data governance function perspective. And then with that in our minds, we'll start turning to, okay, how do you go about building this externally and internally? So what do we want? We want data that matters to us. We want to measure certain things, right? If we care about Indigenous teachers working in our schools, like, that's something that, other governments aren't going to measure. That's something that it matters to us, and we want to be able to collect that data and report on it. We want recognition of data sovereignty, right? Like, is all those barriers Laurel spoke about. If there was true recognition of Indigenous data sovereignty, a lot of those barriers could be eliminated. So some of this is about supporting our leadership to continue to advocate for recognition of data sovereignty. Practically speaking, we want data that's accurate, that's reliable, that comes in on time, right? We're not looking at data 3 years old and trying to make decisions today. That's clear what we're looking at. That is comparable over time, right? So we can say, well, what was it 5 years ago and what is it today? And that all of that is supported by a structure that's transparent and that we believe in. We're also going to talk a little bit about the need for greater infrastructure and support at the IG, within each IGs, to collect and manage their own data systems. And then finally, like, in addition to all of that data that matters to us and going out and collecting it, we also do need that, what Laurel and I have been calling kind of deficit data, which is that gap data. That's still important. I believe that as long as we control it and we are the ones sharing it and speaking about it, that can be data that's helpful to close the gap, to create support advocacy, and isn't used to create greater stigma about us. So if we're going to achieve this vision, collecting all this data internally and externally on things that matter to us and on the gaps that we continue to experience, We need to both navigate external data governance processes, and we're going to go through all of that. So I saw a note in the chat about like, how do you enter into information sharing agreements? That's the kind of stuff we're going to discuss. We also need to set up our internal structures to ensure proper decision making. And these are hand in hand, because we will not be able to source external data without having those policies, procedures, and structures internally to manage that data when it comes. Next slide, please. So ultimately, what does this look like? Like, what are we after? We think about, I mean, this is a simple way to think about it, but in some ways, there's kind of three big buckets. And we want to think about what do the IGs want in each of these kind of buckets. So data acquisition or creation. So going out and sourcing data from outside, or creating that data, collecting it ourselves. Well, we need to, like, what data governance means is that Indigenous governments have approved that. They said, yes, the collection of that data matters. Go ahead and source it. Data governance also means that Indigenous governments shape the methodology and the process for data collection. We know what works, particularly in collecting data from our own citizens or about our own territories. We have different ways, as noted, of transmitting knowledge and sharing data. And so what we think is going to work is what's going to work. And data governance means that that's the process that's followed. It also means that that decision making is throughout all aspects of acquiring or creating data. Stewardship and security of data. So once we have it, then what? And what does governance look like when we have data? It means that data is stored appropriately and that the personal information about us is protected. That means that that's in alignment with both applicable legislation, whether that's our Indigenous governments laws or privacy legislation, and is in alignment with OCAP or the equivalent. It means that only people who are identified and allowed to handle the information have access to it. And it means that we have information sharing agreements with partner organizations that govern how our information is handled. Finally, once we have the data, we're protecting it. How do we use it and, say, publish it? What does governance look like? It looks like we are involved in analysis. And typically that is from kind of a paradigm that's strengths-based for us, right? That's not feeding into old stereotypes, but is about the inherent strength of our people and the fact that actually a lot of these deficits come about as a result of colonialism, not because of anything inherent to us as human beings. It means that the Indigenous governments are involved in the analysis, right? That they're leading that work, that they're interpreting results. It means that the endpoint, like the publication or the intellectual property, is owned by the Indigenous governments. Many of us have had external researchers come into our communities and take our property and kind of make their living off of it. So very, very important that the intellectual property is owned by the government, our government. Again, that Laurel talked about small cell sizes. So how we do the analysis and how we release the results has to protect people's personal privacy. If we're publishing, you know, some sort of stigmatizing type of data, let's say about substance use or about, you know, teen pregnancy or something like that, that we're doing so in a way that protects people's privacy. Approval must be done in a way that involves the Indigenous government, if not entirely rests with them to decide. And that really, before we release a big report, that we honor the people it's about first. So we release and present that information to our own citizens and our own governments first, before that's just released to the general public. So these are just three big kind of ways in which we think about data governance. These are big functions. How do we pull data? How do we protect data? How do we share data? And this is what kind of Indigenous governments, data governance looks like throughout that process. So this is kind of the bird's eye view. And then we're going to talk next about external, kind of how to source external data. So maybe before we kind of transition to that, just ask if there's kind of any questions or kind of stories to share or any comments about any of this. I think what we're going to try to do is we'll go into the external, how to go about sourcing external data requests. And then I think we'll take a break at that point. Might be a little bit after what is going to be 11 o'clock Pacific time. I'm not good at mental math, so I have to go by my own clock here. And then we'll go into internal after the break. So just taking a pause, I'm gonna have a drink of water and ask if there's any questions. You can go to the next slide, Elsie.
And the next one. Thanks.
This is for you, right, Laurel?
Yeah, it is. And I'm looking over it. I think that probably I've chatted about most of the process barriers, but it all comes down to understanding their data governance protocols. But aside from that, there are situations where there really isn't any Indigenous specific data that is available. It's just not being recorded as a data field. There's no easy way, even with a data linkage process, to pull out Indigenous data records, and that does exist. You know, I would love to get information on wait times, and that's sort of a complex, you know, system where a lot of data is held in physician offices, and it's rolled up and provided to government. Well, they don't capture Indigenous data right at the source of the wait, where the wait time data is originates from. So yeah, I guess it's just aspirational on my part. Data can be in private health services, or psychologist offices or public health offices, that sort of thing, that are within. I'm not speaking in your Indigenous government systems, but within cities and towns that where Indigenous people may be accessing services. The next one, data has not been collected from Indigenous communities. Well, that's a big one, that's for sure. Stats Canada doesn't generally do surveys on within First Nations communities or Indigenous governments. So the big surveys like the Canadian Community Health Survey is not available. There is some, of course, some collection up north in Yukon and NWT, and I just actually this morning got information back from Stats Canada asking them about the representation of Aboriginal people in the Canadian Community Health Survey, and it's really, really small. You know, we're talking like a couple hundred folks in Yukon and in WT. So there's not been a lot of investment there from Stats Canada. And of course, and we've mentioned this before, that data collection has not been based on Indigenous needs and priorities. So you may not find what you want when you go into an external data source. And barriers, even anonymized data. Harmony spoke about maybe reticence of citizens having their data stored at a community level. That can be called a barrier. And certainly, Indigenous governments will be very, very precise about only sharing anonymized data, but it might not. There would have to be an education process with the general population to understand all the protocols that are in place so that this data can be accessed and analyzed. Other than that, it's interesting that governments are now saying that even though data is anonymized, and some, can be anonymized by not just taking off names and stuff, but randomly assigning identifiers and stuff like that. They're saying that can be reverse engineered. So this is now starting to be another barrier from external governments, saying that even if it's anonymized, you could de-anonymize it, and so that is a real impediment to getting row level data. By row level, I mean an individual data point that all Indigenous governments will want. So you don't want to have 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 aggregations. You'd rather have data on your own citizens so you can look at it yourself. And perhaps have all the data governance protocols in place to satisfy an external government. But even so, they'll say, no, can't share row level data because it can be de-anonymized. I've heard that reason, as well as lack of, saying that Indigenous governments don't operate under the same privacy legislation, which is a barrier. But I'm digressing a bit, Harmony, sorry. Let's go to the next one. And I think that's yours.
So, we just thought it was important again, to kind of just emphasize that there are a number of issues and barriers that you're going to face when you're trying to pull data about your citizens from external government data sets. I also think there's a couple of ways to address these barriers. One is kind of this amazing work that the IGs are doing as a group collectively. That collectivity and that collaboration creates greater power and strength in addressing these barriers as a group. And then there's also work that each IG will need to do, obviously, on their own to deal with these barriers, especially as they're working with the data about their own citizens. But I just wanted to take a moment to talk about some of the things that the IGs can do as a group. Like continuing to hold other governments accountable for the fact that you have self-governing agreements, and that includes governance rights with respect to data. So just continuing to kind of hold that perspective and hold your partners accountable to uphold those agreements that have been entered into. There's also like this work, right, that you're all doing as a group around, well, let's try to work together so that we can harness some greater kind of capacity, bridging work as a group. And that can extend to things like, reviewing and standardizing all of the data that's now held by your government. I'm sure my own government doesn't have kind of a totally clear and standardized process to, for all of the administrative data that, that they're working with. Either that's paper-based, right? People are filling out forms, or some things are stored in systems. And there could be ways in which the governments work together to kind of create standard terminology, standard ways in which certain data points are collected and represented. And that would allow for some kind of comparability where appropriate, but also allow for a bit of a community to form of people that are working in this space that would then have access to other people working in that space, because many of our governments can't afford to have, a team of 15 kind of data people working. So, we need to kind of create our own community. The other thing to do is consider the possibility of surveys amongst the IGs collectively, right? We could work up some sort of high-level survey that would enable each IG to access and collect data that matters to them on local indicators, but also allow for some infrastructure that's shared across. Again, kind of thinking cost effectiveness here, and the limitation, like there's not that many kind of technical experts working in this space, so we might as well try to work as a group. Participating in existing surveys. So Laurel spoke to both the kind of regional health survey or the Inuit health survey. Laurel and I have been doing some work with the IGs on trying to understand, we're going to talk a bit about this later, but like try to understand within each jurisdiction, what's the data that's available, and how might you go about then accessing it. One of the easiest ones is these health surveys that are run on a routine basis. But the reality is that many of the IGs are not participating in those, either because they're not selected in the sampling process at the beginning, or because they've opted out. So this would be, again, like a very easy way to just kind of opt in, or like be clear that you want to be sampled, and then be able to source that data on your own IG moving forward. And then, again, so just this kind of power in numbers thing, being able to collaborate on certain things around data collection, management infrastructure, things like policy development, development of legislation. Like some things are unique to each IG, but a lot of things are the same. And hopefully we're starting to pull some of those things into this toolkit. And again, invite your feedback as to what that toolkit needs to contain that supports all of you to uphold your functions and data. Okay, so with all that said, that's kind of the collective work. And then we're going to talk about how do you as an IG go about accessing data about your citizens in external government data sets. So I'm going to turn that back over to Laurel for that.
Great. Okay, now this is good news. Yeah, so from what I've seen, governments have come, Indigenous governments have come a long way, both at a regional and an individual level in being able to access data. So I think that the first point of call is to find out where the data is held right now, because you may find that your own provincial or territorial, your regional data steward may have done the heavy lifting for you. In BC, it's FNHA, in other provinces, the regional data steward is often the one that sits at the First Nations Information Governance Center board. And they will have established data arrangements with the external government that allows a transfer of disaggregated data, not row level data, but disaggregated data generally. So that's the first port of call. And then, but there are instances where maybe the data that you want is not with the regional data steward, and you have to go directly to the government entity. If you do have to go directly to government, I'm just trying to think of, it really depends on the jurisdiction, how much work that the regional data steward has already done with government. But even if they haven't done that much, they will have established these processes so that you can use these processes to your benefit, and perhaps go to the regional data steward and say, this is the type of information I want. How can you facilitate this? Because there may be, and again, I speak from a BC experience, but there's a tripartite group. It is tripartite because the need to use Indian register data in order to identify First Nations, but there's a tripartite committee that the FNHA sits on, and they can bring requests like that to the government entity, whether it's the Ministry of, generally it's the Ministry of Health, but it may be one of the sub-departments within it. So once you have that, then you work with you have to work within the applicable data access processes that either the data steward has or government has. It's going to include a data access form, and you see that in the highlighted box. It's some pretty basic information on who you are, why do you want this information, who are your partners, exactly what is the data that you're requesting, how are you going to share it, that's the knowledge dissemination plan, and how do you deal with any security or privacy concerns. And so this will go off to a governance body, whether it be the regional data steward if they've already got the data, or it's going to go to that, to the government bipartite committee generally, and they're going to review this. Okay, you're going to find out the format that you can get the data back. What is it going to be? What's your cell size suppression? Is it going to be 10 or is it going to be 5? What are the geographic limitations? Can you get information on your own community, your own Indigenous government, or do you have to follow the geographic boundaries of the health system? And what are your responsibilities for report publishing? In some instances, this bipartite body may wish to see a copy of your report back. We've alluded to this before, but preparing data is certainly labor intensive. The data steward, whether it be your own data steward or the one within the external government, may have limited resources, and be prepared to spend some time. And then the nice thing, when I said that the Indigenous data steward or the First Nations or Inuit one, whatever, may have done some heavy lifting, they'll probably have an information sharing agreement already established for the data that they have. And so that you can kind of come in underneath that when you request data. But if not, then yes, you're going to have to probably enter into an information sharing agreement, which is on the next slide. Okay, so this is usually set up in pretty much legalese language. It is a binding agreement between the entity that you're requesting information from and yourself. So you can see the variety of information that's there. It's everything from, going through legal definitions. What are the objectives of wanting this data? How are you going to use it? Exactly how is it going to be shared? Is there going to be a data linkage involved? If so, how does that data linkage operate? Who owns the data? And through the knowledge transfer, privacy, security, all the way to disposal. How long are you going to keep this data? If it becomes not, maybe after 7-10 years, there'll be a requirement to dispose it. Where does the intellectual property sit? And often with an ISA, you may want to have a renewal clause in there so you can go back and request data again. And of course, there'll be a termination clause at the end. So I think that's it for that slide. And I believe it's back to you, Harmony, correct? Oh no, I'm still on. Oh, good. This is just using the example of early childhood development, which is what Harmony and I were tasked with last spring, doing sort of a review of what data is available in the ECD sector. I'm not going to go through this in detail, but you can see a lot of service utilization data is available. So it's when a person accesses a hospital or goes to see a physician. Sometimes it gets parsed out into a separate database. In BC, perinatal care you'd have to go to a separate place from that. I would call that a specialty database. It's not within the Ministry of Health itself. First Nation surveys, Inuit surveys, we talked about that. There's a non-insured health benefits. I really haven't talked about that at all. You're all aware of that. It's a very great quantitative database. It uses a slightly different definition of First Nations than you may find with other, for example, what the external government might define. So sometimes there's a little shift there. In Canada, there is a chronic disease surveillance system that each province and territory participate in. So there's an opportunity, and however they manage that information of getting that. And of course, for ECD, we also looked at education. So if we go to the next slide, that's a list of indicators that we found that we went forward with requesting data. And again, service administrative is largely service. Sometimes it doesn't look like it's service-based. For example, cigarette use during pregnancy doesn't sound like it's an administrative indicator, but it came from a physician's chart. And so it's extracted from that. So that's why it comes underneath that. The middle one was primarily RHS data that we used, although the FNREs and the FNLIT are also examples sometimes where you can get similar data. And then over on the right-hand side under education, I found not just in BC, but other jurisdictions do foundational skills assessments and for young grade school kids. And this is math and comprehension and reading skills, which are accessible. And also some jurisdictions may do the early development index or the EDI, which looks for vulnerable children that are in kindergarten. That I know it happens in BC, and but it's more of an international type of index, not just one particular jurisdiction. So you'd have to check with your own to see if the EDI is captured there or not. Thank you.
Okay. So I mean, I know that was Whirlwind, but essentially like the message there is to source external data. There's work to do to get a lay of the land around who's holding what data about your citizens, to navigate data access request processes that those organizations may probably do have. So in this case, even just with ECD, like we looked at multiple data stewards, so the health, education, and like so the Ministry of Health, the education departments, as well as whoever the regional steward is of the surveys, the regional health survey. So just in this case alone, we're working with multiple external partners. We're submitting data access requests to them. We're answering a bunch of questions back and forth that they have kind of throughout the process to clarify the request. We're probably back and forthing about things like cell size and like how their data is organized versus what we're looking for. So where are they collecting it geographically? How are they collecting Indigenous identity on this data? Is it based on, say, a status number of some type? Is it from self-identification? So then there's all that back and forth to clarify for you, like what is the nature of this data? Then there's a process of entering into probably information sharing agreements about that data. That included the kind of key considerations that Laurel covered on that slide. And those agreements can then, once they're in place, in some ways that's a victory that's not just based on the transaction of getting that data, but hopefully that creates an ongoing relationship and partnership that through time you may be able to get into some bit more of a routine basis of sourcing this data from that entity. And as it relates to early childhood specifically, I mean, we had to pick an example because like starting from there's like a lot, this could be this big or this big. So just starting from ECD again, there's like a handful of, 8 or so data sets that early childhood data can be sourced from. And that can be used to tell this kind of story about your citizens based on these indicators you see on this slide. So you can tell as well that there's some value in being able to work together as IGs to try to navigate this process because it is highly administrative. There's a lot of paperwork. There's a lot of detail, back and forth detail, and it takes some time to build up that capacity and the team that would be required to do that on a routine basis in your own IG. Some of you may already have that. Others are kind of getting oriented to that process. So in some ways, trying to collaborate together to work to pull this data about your citizens makes the process a bit easier and at least gives you people to complain about as you're back and forth with government departments about trying to access your own data. So that's external. What we're going to do now is let's take a break. I'll ask that folks I know it was a lot of information and some of this is like, I can't tell if we're being too technical about it or not, but we wanted to give you a realistic picture. So if you can kind of think through the break, if you have any questions, we'll come back, we'll talk through any questions you might have. And then Laurel and I will talk about the kind of other hand in this relationship, which is what is the work that your IG needs to do to create its internal infrastructure to manage this data once it comes to you. Any questions? Any reflections? I know it's a lot to process. I'm someone too who's not a good processor in the moment. Like I tend to need a bit of time to think things through. So I just want folks to know too that I think Allison and Mika shared my email following the last webinar. So I'm happy to get emails from people. If you have questions later, you want to have a quick call to talk about anything that we presented today, I'm certainly available for that. And if you have questions about the external process, it's the most confusing. I wanted to start with that so that we could start to pick up the rest of this webinar in a bit more practical and maybe like feeling a bit more tangible and hopefully end a webinar on a bit more of a optimistic kind of note. So again, feel free to throw questions in the chat if you have them. Otherwise, we'll kind of keep rolling, and we'll again provide more time at the end for reflections and questions as we work through this next module. Can you go to the next slide, please? Probably one more. Are you wowed by Laurel and my abilities with PowerPoint visuals? This was like our effort to come up with some sort of visual. I know it's like kind of embarrassing now that I see it on the screen, but hey, we have other gifts in life, I guess. So this is intended to just show you, like, so we're going to spend our time now to the end talking about what do you need to think about in terms of setting up your own internal data governance processes. And so we're calling that a data governance framework. There's, I think, a more detailed and fairly technical data governance framework document that's embedded in the toolkit. Like, I'm not like necessarily a super technician. I've overseen and administered data governance in my previous roles, and so I was approaching this as a bit more like, you know, as an administrator, what did I need to know, and what was how did I think about it? So we'll talk through vision. How do you establish a vision for data governance within your IG? We're going to use the case study example of that Salingatuck government to just show some options. Same with principles. What are the kind of core principles, and why is this important? Principles drive, like, your vision is what you hope to achieve, the end state. The principles is the ethical way in which you carry that work out. And so principles can be like, they help you understand how you're supposed to make decisions on certain things. What are the factors to keep in mind as you're making decisions? You know, as you're shaping a data governance structure, what are the things it needs to be capable of doing in order to fulfill your principles? And principles are often embedded within your law and policies. So we'll spend a bit of time talking through examples, again, using that case study. Then we're going to talk about kind of core functions, or the why. We talked a little bit about this early on, but we'll just kind of revisit that and say, well, what would this mean in a local IG context? We'll give you an overview of the key components of a data governance structure. We've just, like, for the sake of today, we just included one kind of option, but like, don't feel like that's the option, the only option. It's just an option. And we're going to talk about, like, what are the key components of creating a data governance structure, then what laws and policies to consider having. And then we've already talked about linkages to external partners. That was like the first part of our talk today. So we've already kind of covered that last one, and we're kind of circling back to talk about then building the internal structure that you're going to need in order to receive that external data. Next slide, please. Okay, so now we're going to kind of move through that beautiful fan you saw there. So starting with vision, the vision describes, it should be in a very bold and aspirational way, what your government would like to see in terms of data integrated within your IG. Now, I have a kind of like a bit of a personal struggle with trying to think about like a vision statement for data specifically, because often we as governments, and Gwen Phillips talked a lot about this in the first webinar, we have a bold vision for our whole government and our whole citizenry. This is almost like attached to that, but it's very specific to what you aim to do with data. And again, it kind of helps people that are in decision-making roles understand what it is we're trying to do. And it also helps citizens connect kind of emotionally and mentally, I think, with the work of data, because it can seem so abstract and technical and people kind of tune out. So the vision statement should kind of help people say, oh, I understand why that's important to us, or why that's important to me as a citizen. So in this case, we just kind of made something up. Salingatuck government governs and protects all of our data and information wherever it resides, enabling data's full potential as a strategic asset to better understand and actionably support the needs, priorities, and plans of our citizen, government, and partners. So what does that vision statement tell us? It talks about governing, right? So the sovereignty. It talks about protection. So it signals like we are going to take care and protect all of our data and information. It says wherever it resides, meaning our data governance doesn't just apply to what we hold, the papers we're collecting, our forms, whatever surveys we might run, but it also applies to the information about our citizens that is held externally, like we talked about in the first part of this webinar. And then why, right? The vision statement describes the why. It's so that data is used to better develop knowledge about things that matter to the government and actionably support, meaning it shouldn't just be for the sake of it. Hey, I'm curious about this thing. Let me go and collect a bunch of data on it. Well, no, like the reason to collect data is that it's actionably tied to something that matters to us. It's cascading from our strategic plan. It's based on the needs of our citizens, and it's going to help us make better decisions. So those are all the kind of components that we were thinking, could be involved in a vision statement for an IG. Vision statements are very personal to each government. So just using a fictional example here and just trying to unpack the kinds of things that I would think about if I was kind of involved in crafting something like that for my own government. Next slide. I think this is over to you, Laurel.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so I guess preface this by saying there are all sorts of principles that you could consider to underpin and stand up, I suppose, your data governance protocol and process. These are some of the big picture ones. So the first principle really acknowledges that Salingatuk, or your IG, the jurisdiction applies to the data stored within it and also stored with other entities. Okay, which is just that whole picture perspective that OCAP so eloquently talks about. The analysis and publications are for the benefit and well-being of the nation and its citizens, the government and its citizens, and reflect its worldview. Data provides the evidence to support the actions of government, and it is actionable. I said action twice. I think you get the point. Anyway, so possession of data by government is preferred so that it can create, maintain, disclose, and store data. And if its data is stored in another party's environment or another government's environment, the data will be governed by the government stewards in accordance with its own framework. The government will respect the legal rights of its nation members, clients, and staff over their information, and will maintain and protect their privacy. And of course, data will be of quality, accuracy. It will be reliable, meaning that you can measure it more than once and get the same results. It is clearly understood. It's comparable of whatever your comparison is that you think is relevant for your government. It's timely and it's consistent. And consistent really talks to the fact that you don't want to perhaps change the definition of whatever data it is from one time period to another, so that you can again do trending. Thank you. Next slide. Thanks.
So some of those principles, kind of then help us shape how do we go about carrying out our functions in data. So how do we see this as governments? What are some of the things that we would want to do with data? So we want to improve the outcomes of our citizens, right? So the data will help this government gather, monitor, and track core health indicators. That's an example. Like, this is a choice that's being made, like which of these functions you might want to prioritize or focus on at a given time. Like in some jurisdictions, for example, there's, I know we're using BC examples a lot. It's kind of what we know. So here in BC, there's a provincial health officer, for example. The provincial health officer issues reports on Indigenous health and well-being every 5 years or so. For a lot of nations, that's like sufficient in terms of getting a sense of the overall population health outcomes, because this is like quite a lot of work. In this case, we're saying, well, maybe, in the case of Selingatik government, maybe they've got a population size that's large enough. They really, for them, want to take up the space of improving population health outcomes, tracking that information, measuring, reporting. Operational needs. This is probably true of everyone, every government, right? You need data and information to support your day-to-day business, day-to-day decision making. In this case, for example, we're assuming that Selingatik government has a primary care center, right? A physician or an NP and some staff working on the primary preventative needs of their citizenry. And so they would be collecting information about the citizens that are utilizing that service, what they're there to utilize it for. That might tell them, hey, you know what, we really need a new program for elders because we're seeing, this need amongst our seniors population from the data that we're pulling from primary care. Strategic decision support. So things like, as we go to do a strategic plan. And so in this case, Selingatik government, they're approaching the end of their 5-year strategic plan. They would want to know, what's the current environment around us? Like, what data do we have that informs the type of goals that we might want to create for our government? So maybe, they're finding that their website is getting tons and tons of comments from citizens asking for more information on whatever, council minutes, something like that. Then they would say, okay, well, maybe part of their goal is increased or modernizing their accountability mechanisms with their citizens. Advocacy, another core function of data. So using the data you have to inform, say, funding proposals, right? Let's say there's a call for funding for mental health. You could use the data that you have about mental health needs of your community members, of, say, youth, to include in a funding proposal to government. Evaluation, very, very key. So similar to strategic planning, but maybe a bit more specific to a certain program area, is collecting data year over year, so that at kind of like, say, a 5-year period or a 10-year period, you could do a comprehensive evaluation of that program to identify ways to improve it. And then finally, research. So, there may be, say, external researchers that are interested in collaborating with your government on certain projects. The data you hold and the fact of having a data governance structure will allow the ethical partnership with researchers on your own terms. So the idea there is like, okay, you have this kind of broad vision, you've got your principles in terms of how you want to conduct data business, and then you're applying them in these kinds of functions. And again, it might just be that you're starting with operational needs or strategic decision support. Like, being able to fully embody all of these functions might be, something that's down the road for some of you, or there may be times where you're working on one function more than another and working to build that up and mature it through time. Next slide.
Thanks, Harmony. Okay, governance structure. As Harmony said, this is just one particular model of a data governance board. Maybe to reiterate, the data governance board will be establishing all the aspects of data management. They'll ensure that the policies are in alignment with organizational goals, so that big picture connection with government. And they'll provide the direct oversight for data access, which is a real operational thing, but it's an important component. So in this diagram, you'll see the nation data is in the center. There's a couple of variations of color. The darker band is internally held data, and the lighter one is data that you might get from the external environment or external government. So there's an executive data steward, which is typically the chair of the governance board. Often would be a senior administrator. and in an area that it would be operational, that handles a lot of social data or handles a lot of health data or land data, whatever. It's the model we have on the screen is a distributed data steward model, whereby there would be data stewards that would represent different categories of data interest. And here it's corporate, cultural, land and resource, and human related data, just for examples. So the data stewards, they don't own the data, but they're trusted to oversee it. And they are a link. They're often the link between someone who may want your data within your own government or outside, and the data governance board, the executive data steward, and the board. You might want to bring in subject matter experts as needed. Not that they always will be sitting on the board as a member, but to bring them in, for example, you might want to understand if you want to get into, let me see, food security, for example, what would be the appropriate indicators? How would you collect them? And some of the mechanics of that which will help the data stewards do their business. And just, yeah, overall, just to reiterate that the board does manage and protect data in accordance with its framework, with policy, and with law. And it is the overarching structure. I think over on the side, I've rejigged my screen here somehow, so I'm missing half of the graphic. But there is on the side, I know there's a little graphic showing the admin support that'll be needed. Sometimes even just handling the data requests that come in and dealing with that. There's also analytical support that'll be required, that'll feed into the, through the data steward to prepare the data for whoever is requesting it. If it's indeed a function where the data is going back out of your database. There are data custodians, and I like the analogy that a data custodian is the plumbing and the data steward is the water flowing through the plumbing. So they're there to ensure that the data flow happens, and technically everything is on board. And legal counsel, you may want to bring in as necessary, certainly for your policy and law and information sharing agreement aspects of work that you're doing. Thank you.
So maybe an example here, I was trying to, because Laura was talking, I was trying to think about an example that would implicate everyone in this. So I think there is an example in one of the frameworks I was looking at related to like a spill, right? So let's say that there was some sort of like environmental contaminant spill into the water supply. And the nation wants to produce an impact assessment that will inform both their response as well as the recoup of all sorts of like whatever the rehabilitation plan is going to be. So in that case, let's say whoever from the government administration submits a data access request to the data governance board for relevant data on this contaminant spill. So you could see that, for example, the human related data steward would have to be thinking about and examining the data request related to any health sector data they had, right? Are there any human health impacts to individuals as a result of that contaminant? Maybe it's the housing data, right? Like how is this the community's water supply? How is this impacting housing? On corporate data, what costs have we incurred as a result of this spill? What have we already spent? How many people hours have been spent on this from our administrative team? Cultural data, it might tie to traditional use of the impacted areas, traditional teachings about water and people's relationship with water. And land and resource data might look at, well, what are the impacts of the spill on say the fish supply? And so everyone would have to examine this from their their data perspective, but then they come around a table because this is one impact assessment, and the executive data steward would need to think about it, in its totality. Legal counsel would be important here because, maybe there's legal action associated with this contaminant. event. So anyway, just wanted to kind of give you a sense of like what might this actually look like if we think about an example of a data access request that might hit the table. They would then kind of work together, pull together the data and the analysis on all of those indicators and factors and share that back with the requester and work with them throughout the process. So as they're then preparing that for submission to some external body, this data governance board would be involved in reviewing and approving that in alignment with their principles, right? So is this data culturally appropriate that we're sharing? Does it reflect our worldview? Is this going to have benefit to our people, the production or the report as it's drafted? Is this going to be helpful for us? Is the privacy of individuals protected? So that's kind of a way we kind of think about how all of this might come together in terms of one specific request. Next slide. And all of this is kind of governed by law and policy. So Jennifer Jansen had indicated in the chat early on that IGs will need to have some of this infrastructure, laws and policies in place in order to access external data and certainly to manage any data that they collect on their own. Law and policy will provide for, like, it gives guidance to like what's seen as appropriate. How do we make sure that everybody knows our perspective, right? What our principles are. They'll know it, and because of that, it makes sure that things are consistent through time, right? If everybody knows what's expected and people follow the policy and law, then it creates consistent use of data, which contributes to data quality. And it outlines how data is to be managed. So everything we talked about, like the reason this slide is kind of close to the end is because the law and policy kind of needs to encompass everything that we've talked about so far. Often there could be a number of laws at play here, like each IG will kind of do their own thing, each jurisdiction does its own thing. But typically, there'll be at minimum like a protection of personal information or a privacy law, a freedom of information and protection of privacy law. Some may get to a place of having kind of data governance law. Often that is captured at a policy level, just as often. Again, it'll kind of talk about like what are the principles that we covered earlier. It'll talk about structure. So it'll say like, therefore, a data governance board is established. It's composed of the following. Doesn't need to follow that exact model we had on the previous slide. We know that the tool in the toolkit that you have gives a number of other options that you can scale up or scale down based on how complex, how much data you're working with. And it'll also kind of describe a number of other important factors, such as those listed on this screen. So again, the requirement that analysis and publication kind of follow teachings, meet their definitions of quality, follows established process. So what is appropriate use? It may talk about availability, right? It'll outline some parameters around the availability of data, how easy it is to access, provide for things like what is the data access request process. It'll talk about potentially usability, right? Like standards to say that, there'll be a certain classification system followed. There'll be standardized terms and definitions. Typically a policy or a law will just say something as simple as that, right? We will have consistent ways of managing our data. It'll be structured a certain way. And then more detailed procedures kind of at the desk might outline exactly what those look like, what the specific data fields are, what have you. And then very importantly, security and privacy. This is probably the most critical in terms of being able to source external data, especially, which is just, ensuring that there's proper safeguards in place, proper security measures to avoid data loss or release of personal information, making sure that it's only those who need to have access to personal information. So keeping this kind of fairly general in that I think there's, I think it's important for governments to draft laws and policies that suit their own specific circumstances, but these are very typical requirements in those kinds of documents. And Jen let me know in the chat that there are a number of examples that are linked within the toolkit. So you could review those and kind of get a sense of which of those might apply best, mix and match to your circumstances. Okay, next slide. So we're gonna open it up to questions in a second. I just wanted to offer a few kind of thoughts. Like, this is a lot of information, and it's a bit unclear, like, how do you give kind of high level information that's enough for people to start to relate to their circumstances. And we just reiterate again the advisors that are available to you to kind of work to make this more real in your current context. It's very important because of all of this, like, people's eyes glaze over when you start talking about some of this stuff. So being able to have broad leadership management support of the work. Again, if it's a helpful tool for you to have some sort of like slide deck similar to this, like much simpler and shorter to digest, for you to start socializing within your context, like that would be easy to pull together. Starting with a small project might be good. This feels very overwhelming and kind of speculative, right? Like, does this even matter to us? Like, how much data do we have? So you might just want to pick something. Like, maybe there's like one priority that your nation has or your government has that's like, we need to understand what data we have on this and govern it properly. Or, there's one particular data set that's like a real mess. And it would benefit from some standardization and some thinking through. So starting small works, and this is again where the advisors can help work through that with you. The toolkit is here. Save time and money. This can be a really expensive space, and unnecessarily so. Like, some of this stuff is very easily exported into certain different contexts. So hopefully the toolkit's useful for you there. And this is all intended to lead into a bit more practical. What you're going to be able to see is like, well, how do we design indicators and how do we collect data? And those are coming in the next couple of webinars. So I'm going to take a breath. I see Jennifer has her hand raised. So yeah, we have a little bit of time. Let's hear from you if you have any questions or thoughts, or in the chat, or raise your hand. Can we go to Jen?
Hi, can you hear me?
We can.
Awesome. So thank you so much, Harmony. I just wanted to speak to the last slide about the data governance laws and policies. And I just wanted to point out that there are actually not a lot of examples of data governance policies that are comprehensive in the way that was pointed out in the slide. And what you'll probably find is that a lot of examples of there are different aspects of that kind of different pieces of that are covered off in different kinds of legislation. So you'll probably see more that, like, the security and privacy will be covered off in things like access to information and FOI legislation. The usability would probably be more something you would find in statistics laws or other. So it's if you're looking for an example of a data governance policy or data governance law that comprehensively covers all of those aspects, and you're not finding it, it's not you. It's that the legislation and policy framework in this country is still catching up to technology, and so there will be sort of pieces of different kinds of legislation that you might have to kind of cobble together to bring to create a more comprehensive data governance policy or law, like the one that you're talking about here. Not that we shouldn't strive to do that, but just that you probably won't find a ton of examples that include all of these things. But all of these things can be found in different kinds of legislation that exists and policies that exist already.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I'll take another cruise through this part of the toolkit, because I do think it would be helpful to have some of this tied into potentially what a policy might be called, or, so there's certain things like information security policies would provide for a bunch of stuff. Personal information, privacy policies, as noted, kind of analysis and statistical policies. The data governance board itself will have its own set of policies around how it operates. So absolutely, like some of this may be not, typically it's not all in one place. It's a set of policies or laws in relationship with each other. Any other questions, comments, feedback? What tools would be useful for you? I have no idea if that's a good or a bad thing. Okay, we have a hand raised from Melanie Woods. Can we enable her mic?
Hello. So I had a question. I know we were just talking about the privacy information, because I know also if there's a possibility that, when we work on data or we develop data, one thing is that, like, if we move from one entity to another entity, that we can't take that, we don't own it, the organization owns it. Because one thing I do see is that sometimes people have a misinterpretation of that, is that because they developed it or they did it, that they are able to take it with them, or they share it. And so that's why I say, like, our laws need to be, and information need to be very specific, is that when you're being paid by an organization, that organization owns that data, not the individual who developed it. And just because they're, just for privacy reasons, because I don't see that being shared enough. I just wanted to bring that up.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I think it's kind of an intellectual property issue, right? Like, whose property is this kind of ultimately? And it's not personal property. That, say, if I'm in a consulting arrangement with the IGs and I'm helping pull their data on ECD and presenting it, that's not my data. That is a service that I'm providing. And the intellectual property and the data itself rests kind of with the IGs. So certainly there's been a history of not good behavior and treatment of our governments in that. And so couldn't agree more that how critical it is to protect that through law, policy, and practice. I had a comment in the chat around, is it possible to have a roadmap? Like, how do we take all of this and say step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5? Like, certainly, I think if that would be helpful, if you can like indicate that to us in the chat or an email. Like, it's not going to be the same for everyone, but certainly we could give a sense of what needs to happen before other things can occur. It would also be easy enough to show where things that IGs can maybe do on their own relative to where collaborating with others would be of benefit. I see Sue's got her hand up. If we can enable her mic.
This is just a general question. It's not specific to the toolkit or to the webinar, but Hamalco, I'm with the Hamalco First Nation in Campbell River, and we've just had a big slide in the territory, and in addition to that, the chief has led some work trying to get the fish farms out of the territory. And I was talking yesterday with an anthropologist who's done an awful lot of work in the territory years and years ago. Of course, there's no data sharing agreement. There's no OCAP principles. He's willing for a price to, and I'm just wondering if anybody's had any experience working long-term, going backwards without any of these tools in place, and how they dealt with, have they been successful getting the information that really belongs to Hamalco or to their nation, to their government, back into their government without paying? Yeah,
that's such a common, like, I feel totally angry hearing that. Like, it's so common. Like, that's happened certainly in my own nation. It's happened in my own research experience. where it was like, oh no, I own the copyright. And I was like, what are you talking about? So, I mean, that's not long ago. That's in, my career in the last 10 years ago. So it is certainly, those situations can be challenging because I think we are trying to draw on people's kind of do the right thing, as opposed to have the tools to really be able to go back and address that. Certainly, there are some tools in that broader environment related to maybe things that might be held by, museums or archives. When it's held by an individual researcher, I mean, I've been successful once by drawing on someone's do the right thing. And yes, I'm capable, and yes, our nation is capable of handling that. Thank you very much. And then in one case, I wasn't, and they still are asking for, multiple tens of thousands of dollars for intellectual property belonging to the nation. So I'd be interested to hear if there's anyone else who's got kind of an experience of that, or have had success in working, kind of drawing on past information in that research space. It's a huge problem.
Doesn't sound like it. Thank you, Harmony.
Any other questions? If not, I'll kind of move towards wrapping us up. So this was third. So we're halfway through now for those that have been following along throughout. This one, to be honest with you, was like one of the hardest ones to wrap my mind around how we were gonna do this. I think for this one in particular, it's really important to try to draw on the advisors to make this information practical at a local setting. I'll ask Mika to share my email around with everyone. Again, if there's follow-up questions, I'm more than happy. The next webinar will be on March 9th, and we're going to talk about indicators. I'm really excited for that one. We have Kai working up some really great stuff for us, and I'll be chiming in with them, talking about things like wellness indicators in that webinar. Hoping we can get you all engaged in the survey. For those who haven't, I know we only got like a couple of responses, but it just helps us to try to improve for future webinars. So if you have feedback for us, please share it, and including the pop-up poll that will show up on your screen momentarily as we bring ourselves to a close. So thank you all for joining us today, and really look forward to, I'm happy to see your faces this time. It's made my experience better, and look forward to hopefully seeing you again at the next webinar on the 9th. Take care.